The bear versus man question is, if you were alone in the woods, would you rather see a bear or a man? And it's part of this radical feminist ideology to say, oh, I'd much rather see a bear in the woods than a man.
Would you rather be stuck in a forest with a man or a bear?
The bear. Bear.
Oh, of course women would rather see a bear than a man. Men are predators. Men are dangerous. Unlike bears, men will hurt them. The problem is if these women actually saw a bear, they'd immediately be thinking, I wish there was a man around. A small minority of men commit violent crimes, and women are a small minority of those violent crimes. But it's always okay to stigmatize men in ways that aren't true, because men are at the top of the patriarchy. It's totally harmless. Now, I know what lots of you are thinking. Tom, this isn't a serious thing. It's a meme. It's just a provocative saying to get people's attention on violence against women. It's only something to shed a light on women's fear against men, no matter how irrational that fear might be. And I initially thought the same thing, until I realized pretty much every woman or man who answers bear tries to give a logical, rational justification. They don't just say, it's a feeling based on past trauma, but instead try to give statistics and rationale to back up their bigoted answers. And to be clear, it is a bigoted answer. Now, before we get into that, let me give all the caveats. Both men and women can be perpetrators of violence against both men and women, or other. I do understand that women are smaller, weaker, and less capable against men in a physical altercation. They are the victims of domestic violence at very high rates, and domestic violence is the most underreported violent crime, which not only means that these victims never get to see justice for the crimes committed against them, but they are also likely still living with the person who is abusing them, and therefore the abuse often lasts for long periods of time. But since the violence is almost always coming from the person they live with, the stats on abuse do not justify the bear answer the way that these zoophiles think.
Welcome, one and all, to yet another episode of Wick TV. Gang, have we got a show for you? Man versus bear. Who would you rather be trapped alone in the woods with, a man or a bear?
Actually, the original question is, if you were in the forest and you came up on a random bear or random man, which one would you pick? I picked the bear because A, statistics on what men have done in the past to women. B, there are precautionary steps when approaching a bear versus approaching men. There's literally none. So I think the safest option would be to choose a bear.
If I were to stumble across alone in the woods a bear or a man, I would have rather much stumble across the bear.
Go ahead.
It depends what kind of bear. I would say I like 100% black, like a black bear. You can fight off. Grizzly bear, polar bear, like man, woman, like I mean, people have survived bear attacks, but like you're pretty fucked if they do aggress towards you. But this is my point. I'm not saying men are like all dangerous or like you should be scared of them. Also, I think like the context of like what kind of woods, what season, like what's the situation, like where in the woods are you? But anyways, besides all that, I'm saying the likeliness of a man who does attack you, like you're more likely to survive a bear attacking you than a man attacking you. And I think the probability of a man attacking you is more likely than a bear attacking you.
Okay, let's start here. So pretty much all of the arguments that we just heard here were completely fallacious, illogical, or were just totally using the wrong data sets to come to a conclusion. I can't believe I'm about to explain this. They are correct that the species of bear, time of season, and region will make a statistical difference in the probability that you'll be killed by the bear. And they are correct that the chances of being attacked by a bear is 1 in 2.1 million. Mostly because most of us never encounter bears, just based on location alone. Because most of us don't live anywhere near bears, meaning this stat is completely useless. By that logic, you'd rather encounter an African lion with rabies than a dog, since more Americans get killed by dogs each year than African lions with rabies. But in this hypothetical, you aren't going to use stats based on your chances of encountering a bear. The hypothetical demands that you encounter the bear while alone in the woods, and based on stats from Alaskan bear attacks, you have an 11% chance of dying and almost a 90% chance of hospitalization. Now, I can't find any estimates on how many interactions humans have with bears, but bearsmart.com says there are thousands each year. So the lowest number would be 2,000, and the highest about 9,000. And there's about 40 bear attacks each year, meaning there's a 0.445% chance of getting attacked by a bear per interaction by the most charitable estimates.
Once again, I've said this like 10 times. I'm not afraid of average men, and I don't think it's a high probability for that to happen if there is a man in the woods. I'm just saying, probability-wise, I think you have a better chance of ending up with a better
You keep
situation
saying
with a bear.
probability like you have actual probability. You haven't mentioned any probability. You just saying the word probability doesn't make it so.
I do. I literally have stats. There's statistics.
Okay,
Yeah,
wait.
but
Your statistics are
We
bullshit.
gotta
because
be
you're not taking into
concise.
You're not taking into account the billions and billions and billions and billions of interactions that happen between humans every single day that don't happen between bears. They're not comparable.
I think I would argue that it is.
Now let's talk about men. These women were also correct that it's almost impossible to calculate the likelihood of getting attacked by this man in the woods. But we can at least get to the point where we know the likelihood is a bare minimum lower than X. The average person will encounter about 3 million people in their lifetime. Let's assume about half of those are men. So we'll say you'll encounter about 1.5 million men in your life. Of those 1.5 million men, if 0.01% of them assaulted you, you'd be assaulted by 150 men in your lifetime. If 0.00001% of them assaulted you, you'd be assaulted by 0.15 men in your lifetime. Since 1 in 6 women report to be assaulted at some point in their life, this number is fairly accurate, meaning you have less than a 0.00001% chance of a violent crime being committed against you by any one individual man in general. Not only has less than 4% of the country been convicted of violent crimes, not all of that 4% being men, and you're very unlikely to encounter anyone in that 4%, but you're very, very unlikely to be one of the people they assault in this specific scenario. 1% of that 4% commits 63% of those violent crimes, meaning you're super unlikely to come into contact with someone who has been convicted of a violent crime, and even more unlikely for you to be the person for it to be committed against, but even super way less likely to come into contact with someone who's committing them perpetually. Not only that, but most violent crimes are committed against men. And we aren't just talking about violent crimes in general in this scenario. We're talking about violent crimes committed outside, in the woods, in public, against women. 70% of violent crimes committed against people in public are committed against men. The most common violent crimes committed against women are sexual violent crimes. And since most sexual violent crimes are much more likely to be committed by a family member or someone close to you, rather than a stranger, regardless of the gender of the victim, then that means men have a higher probability of being a victim of this man in the woods than a woman. Meaning the chances of a man attacking a woman in the woods in the first place is so unlikely she could encounter well over 1 million men before probabilities came even close to 0.0000001% chance of getting assaulted by one. Because such a small percentage of men are actually committing these horrific acts, the man is not only more likely to be assaulted, but probably more likely to protect her than assault her himself. Now let's add the fact that being in the woods doesn't make it more likely that this man will attack you. According to Thermarest, you have a 0.0003% chance of being a victim of a violent crime on BLM Fish and Wildlife Service or National Park Service lands. Encountering a bear has a much higher likelihood of pain and injury than encountering a man, or even a man who is convicted of a violent crime. So based on the irrational thought processes from all of these women, if you were a math problem in the woods waiting to be solved, which would you hope to encounter? A bear or a woman? Even asking that question is likely considered sexist, and rightly so. And if a bunch of videos went viral of men answering bear, we'd likely have a bunch of feminists pulling up studies to refute it. Yet when people refute the baseless studies and logic feminists have been giving for why bears actually are safer than men, we're told that we're missing the entire point and need to introspect.
I just don't understand how you can be a guy and read, hey, women might be kind of nervous around you, and think this is just like if racism. I don't know. From where I'm sitting, I've been told my entire life, never put people into buckets based on immutable characteristics. Some women love being stay-at-home mothers, blah, 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 blah. Wait until you find out some insert race people might steal your shit. Not all insert race people is demeaning, discriminatory, even dehumanizing. But with men, we can. Help me to square the circle. Listen, you can act on stereotypes around people, okay? It's just if your stereotypes manifest in a harmful way in analysis or action, that's a different thing. Also, please keep in mind, okay, this whole hypothetical is about getting you to reconsider your behavior, okay? Like, what are men doing to women to prompt that? You have to ask, okay? What are black people doing to white people to prompt people being racist? The answer? Nothing. White people were racist against black people for a wide variety of cultural and economic reasons that stretch back hundreds of years. It's for existing. Are women afraid of men for men existing? Well, no, it's centuries and millennia of like incredibly consistent sexual predation and violence. That's like the whole point is introspection.
Okay, Vash. So then let's change the hypothetical. Yes, men commit 80% of violent crimes while only being 49% of the United States. Black people commit 51% of murders and non-negligent manslaughter in the United States while being only 13% of the country, and commit almost all violent crimes at a more than triple the rate their proportionality of the population. So let's ask women, if they were alone in the woods, would you rather see a bear or a black person? I guarantee Vash would not only call anyone who answers bear racist, but he would rant and rave about how Nazis and fascists are taking over the country.
White supremacy can be as vague and indistinct as like a Karen in some suburban neighborhood, like calling the police because she thinks there are some suspicious dudes outside because they're like black and they're just chilling.
You have a problem with the words thugs, thieves, and criminals?
Well, it's not about the words itself, it's about how sometimes they're disproportionately used and assigned to black people and brown people in ways they aren't to white people. And I would argue that kid who is ignorant about like crime and such, I would argue that that kid is a racist. I don't think.
You think so?
When I say racist, I'm not saying that. I'm not making a moral prescription like this person has failed like inherently. I'm just saying like their thought processes have led them towards a point where they're passively enabling racist thought.
But it's not black people who are committing all of those crimes. It's just the black men. So anyone who answers bear is still only answering that way because of the sex, not the race.
And that would be a great cope to make yourself feel better, but I'm pretty sure if the original question was, would you rather see a bear or a human, no one would have answered bear, and the question would have seemed totally pointless. The stigma and fear attached to the concept and gender of men is what causes people to answer bear. Vash is also wrong that the reason we don't allow people to judge the individual based on the group is because of harm. It's that too, but also because it's a fallacious thought process. The reason it's wrong morally is because it's wrong on the facts. And if you're wrong on the facts, then you're spreading misinformation. Only 5% of all Americans go to prison at some point during their lives. That's 9% of all men and 16% of black people. So no matter which way you cut it, it's still a very small minority that you're using to judge an entire group. And as mentioned before, only 4% of men are arrested for violent crimes. So saying men are violent means you're wrong about 95% of the group you're referring to.
But men are committing higher crime rates because they are men. Black people aren't committing higher crime rates because of their race.
Well, actually, if I didn't get myself canceled already, this is definitely going to do it. Testosterone has been shown to have a positive causal effect on crime, and black people have both higher rates of free and mean testosterone levels compared to white people on average. Cortisol dysregulation also has a positive causal effect on crime, which black people also have disproportionately compared to white people. But also, systemic racism has widely affected black people based on race, and very likely plays into crime from the black community as well. Meaning that, since it affects them based on race, that means race is still the dividing motivator here.
But men are bigger, faster, and stronger on average compared to women, regardless of race, still making them seem scarier and more capable if they do choose to commit a crime.
Yes, that's true. And the fastest people in the world are almost always black. The people who jump the highest are almost always black. And since black people have higher testosterone rates, they do put on muscle more easily than white men and have higher bone density. There's good reason why over 70% of the NBA is black. But even though black men are bigger, faster, and stronger than white men, we would still say it's racist for white men to be afraid of black men or to pick bear over a black man. But again, by far the majority of black men or women are not committing violent crimes.
Once again, this whole situation is about women experiencing shitty things in their life, and the statistics of men doing shit, and the fact that women aren't willing to take a chance of something terrible happening to them. The fact you think women are terrible fucking people because they don't want to take that chance is something is wrong with you.
The logic women who pick bear use applies to black men at 3 times the rate it applies to men in general. Yet still would be illogical and very racist because it's a mischaracterization. It blows my mind that so many people are defending this rhetoric, that if we allow and are consistent, we would be justifying disgusting racism against black people. If anywhere near the majority of black people were dangerous, we might be having a very different conversation. But instead, it's the minority of a minority of a minority of a minority that are committing the crimes that we're talking about, and even a minority of those who commit them perpetually. It's all bigotry. But these people are justifying a woman crossing the road just because a man is walking behind them, just as long as that man isn't black.
It's disgusting behavior. You recognize that as well. You're a toxic person. You're also racist. It's very clear in this conversation. You don't even know who George Floyd is.
Just throw it in racism.
Okay, I'm sexist, racist. Do I hate cats and dogs too? You want to go down the list?
I mean, I don't know.
But
they're animals. So if you only hate men. Thank you. Exactly.
Yeah, you do. You do hate men. I think that much.
And you're bringing awareness. You're making me hate women.
Good.
Okay, you're making me hate women might be a bit extreme, especially since women on the internet aren't all that representative of women in the real world. But even more so, radical feminists definitely aren't representative of anyone, anywhere, except for radical feminists on the internet.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica. Would you rather be stuck in the woods with a man or a bear? Answer the question, starting with you. Go ahead.
A man. I think a man.
A man.
I guess the man.
The man.
100% the man. No questions asked.
Apparently.
Oh, fuck.
The idea of men being dangerous is way more pervasive online, and it makes sense that women might become a bit more afraid of men when they are constantly hearing horror stories about how dangerous we are. But his response to say she's making him hate women is the same exact thought process that she's using. I've encountered tons of dumb, ditzy women in my life. Some who play dumb just to get what they want, and I give it to them. And others who really are just that dumb. Yet women on average aren't dumber than men, and I can obviously just look up stats to see that women have similar IQs to men and test very well in schools. But lots of those dumb women stick out in my memory, and because they stick out from my past, they are likely to influence my perception of women disproportionately compared to more general boring Alberta Einsteins that I run into on a day-to-day basis. So it's understandable that the guy on this panel is more likely to hate women because of radical feminists on the internet who will obviously stick out among others. Or that I'll start to think that women are dumb, but women in general are not going to be okay with either of these perceptions, even though the perception is understandable based on some experiences. And when men pick the bear to solve the math problem in the woods over a woman, most women will feel dehumanized and rightfully argue against the idea that a bear is better at math. Now, I could find studies showing that a bear can do math, and I could find lots of anecdotes of women being stupid. But these sorts of stereotypes aren't only hurtful, but harmful. They'll likely cause discrimination against women and limit the majority of those who aren't actually dumb. And while women are getting into more positions of power, it'll likely limit some men in opportunities if women think they are better off with a ferocious monster around them.
When I first heard this question, I will admit that I immediately kind of jumped camp to the side of, yeah, you would pick a man, because of course the average guy is probably just some welder with a hiking hobby, and a bear is a bear. But as I kept listening to the different arguments, I have to admit I did hear a lot for the bear that kind of made me shift my side a little bit. It was pretty irritating to have my personal opinion attacked like that, and I've got to imagine that's exactly how all of the women who have picked bear are feeling when they're told that they're stupid, idiotic, or told they can't wait to smell the scent of their organs as a bear tears them limb from limb. Yes, I have seen men say that to women. I think the biggest takeaway from this for men should be that whether you like it or not, women do find you as scary or scarier than a bear, and that is just something you have to accept and adapt to.
This is a problem that people who watch my streams have heard me talk about for years. I call it the predator complex, meaning you are perceived as a threat and treated as dangerous, making you question your own self-perception. Some people try to get away from you as though you might hurt them. Seeing someone cross the road because they think you might kill them can really mess with your head. Many men have said they try to stay away from parks and playgrounds because they believe mothers see them as an inherent threat. Pulitzer Prize winner Brent Staples wrote, "Being perceived as dangerous is a hazard in itself." He explains that even just the perception of being dangerous can have detrimental effects, leaving lots of people with only a few options. Some hide away to avoid the othering they'll feel from the public, while others might convince themselves that they truly are dangerous and buy into the idea and become the stereotype. This sort of problem is perfectly understandable to most people when we apply it to minorities, but not men in general, as though white men have a different psychology and brain. Maybe the feminists should measure our skulls.
It's just that takeaway has been kind of lost because the whole thing has been co-opted by this raging troll fest of people who are absolutely livid with each other for their personal, harmless opinions.
According to Good Therapy, who wrote an article referencing the study from QM Hume of the Department of Psychology at California State University on the psychological effects of discrimination, they said, "The findings revealed that the higher the frequency of perceived discrimination, the higher the levels of reported anxiety and depression in the participants. The results also showed that participants who did experience extreme discrimination, although infrequently, were equally adversely affected. The research team was able to determine that, overall, the frequency of less stressful discrimination was more detrimental to the participants' psychological well-being than less frequent high-stress discrimination experiences."
Not really sure why this is a debate, but here we are. And a whole lot of comments from people who don't understand women's stories or statistics. So to be clear, the answer is unequivocally a bear, and here are the two reasons why. First, the numbers. In the United States, there are 340,000 bears and about 57 million hikers, 26 million of which are female. Since 2020, there have been exactly 7 women killed by bears and 15 non-fatal attacks on women. In the US, there are also 165 million men and 168 million women. Since 2020, there have been 8,000 fatal attacks on women by men and 1.6 million non-fatal attacks. Which means even in this impossible hypothetical of 165 million bears, you're still greater than 2 times more likely to be killed by a man than a bear if you're a woman in the United States, and about 220 times more likely to be involved in a non-fatal attack by a man than a bear. Oh, also, I should note, statistics on bear attacks are not infamously underreported, unlike the other side of the equation, where statistics show that only about 1/5 of violent encounters against women by men are actually reported, and less than 1/5 of those actually lead to an arrest, and less than 1/100th of those lead to a felony conviction, which means 1% of the ones that are actually reported. Meaning not only that men who perpetrate these acts are much more likely to go free than they are to be punished, but also have the opportunity to do it again. Whereas, by the way, in the United States, when a woman who brings a legal claim of self-defense, they are 2 times more likely to be found guilty of a crime themselves than when a man brings up a claim of self-defense. It's almost like we just don't believe women or something. You know? Speaking of which, the second reason why the answer is bear. It's because women are telling you that it's bear. That's kind of all that matters.
I'm not going to go over why it's dumb to use overall deaths from bears again, since we all understand that we don't encounter bears anywhere near as much as we encounter men.
And I've seen a whole lot of comments from people who don't understand women's stories or statistics.
And I hope I don't have to explain why it's even dumber for him to only use the numbers of women's deaths, as though bears are discriminating based on gender.
I read somewhere that their periods attract bears. The bears can smell the menstruation. Well, that's just great. You hear that, Ed? Bears. Now you're putting the whole station in jeopardy.
But he does make a bunch of other claims along gendered lines, as though he's addressing a discrepancy and discrimination between abusive men and women. And since a lot of what we're talking about here is people stigmatizing men and misusing or ignoring data, I figured I'd take just a moment to go over data that rarely gets mentioned, because if it did, it would likely change the perception of men. According to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, they say 44% of men have experienced sexual/physical or stalking at some point in their lifetime, and that men claim physical domestic abuse at slightly higher rates than women. They also mention that these are low estimates since men are much less likely to disclose that information. A Harvard study shows that both men and women admit women are the physical instigators of one-sided fights in relationships at a 70% rate, and that 50% of fights in relationships are reciprocal. And of those reciprocal fights, women are the first to strike the majority of the time. So while arrest records show men commit 90% of violent crimes, women's violent crimes are not only massively underreported if men are claiming abuse at the same rate, but women are also half as likely to be convicted of violent or sexual crimes than men in court. Now, women are just as likely to receive prison time for violent felonies, but they are less likely to be charged or sentenced to violent felonies. And when they do receive violent felonies, they get shorter prison sentences. Women have higher rates of simple assault, a misdemeanor, and women's violent crimes were more likely to be pled down to misdemeanors, meaning women's felony violent crimes are likely a bit higher than arrest or sentencing stats would make it seem. In their paper on domestic abuse, the American Journal of Public Health says, anytime information comes out saying men are victims of abuse at similar or higher rates to women, the media cherry picks the data about women's abuse and widely ignores anything that will break the paradigm of men being scary and violent and women being victims. And just real quick, as a side note, while researching this section, it was actually really hard to find some of these numbers. Numerous websites seemingly dedicated to domestic abuse in general only showed stats on women's abuse and only mentioned men as perpetrators of abuse. It's actually really interesting. Gay men have the lowest rate of domestic abuse, and lesbians have the highest rates, with 50% of lesbians reporting sexual abuse and up to 90% psychological abuse. Meaning, men would ironically have lower rates of abuse if they would just be with men, and women would have higher rates if they were with women. And while women are more likely to be victims of sexual abuse, and most sexual abuse is from an intimate partner, women who are married are the least likely to be victims of sexual abuse or any violent crimes. Women who never get married are 4 times more likely. But underreporting of abuse from men and the over-focusing on women's abuse really makes men seem a lot more violent than they likely are. I've personally experienced sexual, physical, and psychological abuse from women in my past. And I always had to explain to those women how different their actions would be if they were men. But that never changed any of their actions going forward. One of those women even recently messaging me to tell me that she didn't like how I seemed to be implicitly invalidating women's abuse in a video. The problem again isn't whether or not women are choosing correctly when they pick the bear. It's their personal choice, they can pick whatever they want. It's the use of incorrect justifications and skewing of data over and over in an attempt to mislead people about violence from men. I'm not upset that women are afraid of men based on their personal experiences, and I totally understand why one might pick a bear over a man. Some women have said that the question bear versus man is actually a question of certain death versus a certainty of rape. And while I'm glad that these people believe that the bear represents death, it seems wrong for a man to represent automatic rape. If instead they said a high chance of death is preferred over a low chance of rape, that would make more sense and be completely understandable.
It's interesting to see how many men are surprised by the fact that women are like bear. And I think it's also very obvious for women why we would choose bear.
I do realize why women are afraid of men. Even if women were just as likely to assault men, men are more capable of defending themselves, therefore still making any physical encounter much scarier for women. Because the reality is that there are tons of creeps out there. Young women are taught from early ages to be cautious. Don't get into cars with strange men. Cover your drink if you put it down. If you're ever going to be alone with a man, text someone beforehand, just in case he abducts you. That way we know who he is. It's wild to me to imagine preparing to be abducted before going to hang out with a friend or going on a date. The thing I'm fighting here is not whether or not women should be cautious. I'm fighting the idea that it's okay to use this caution to stigmatize men. Just because I'm taught to lock my doors doesn't mean I should treat my neighbors like thieves. To me, the hypothetical is a tool used to show how women are afraid of men, though there's not much most of us can do about it since over 90% of us aren't predators. All we can do is take this feeling into consideration while we're around women. But when you start to justify this idea that men are dangerous and try to use stats to say that you'd have a better chance with a wild beast over a man, this isn't a cautionary hypothetical anymore, but a harmful trope and an incorrect stereotype. Women should be cautious, but they should not keep gassing each other up to make men seem scarier than they actually are. So while I do believe men should take women's feelings into consideration and adjust their behavior accordingly,
And that is just something you have to accept and adapt to.
I do not believe this is something men should just accept. Women know some men think they're dumb, and this is a reality they have to deal with and adapt to. But no self-respecting woman would say that she just accepts this type of discrimination or stereotype. They will likely call it out for the sexism that it is and fight against it anytime they see it. The feeling being reasonable does not mean it's logical, moral, or justified. When I was talking to a woman about the fact that I was working on this video essay, she said to me, "Well, Tom, of course I'm going to think all men are violent, because every person who has ever physically hurt me has been a man." This is the type of logic that leads to racism, homophobia, conspiracy theories. Since she thinks that every person hurting her being a man means that all men are now violent, then by this logic we can say, since every president was born in the United States, every person born in the United States is also the president. Men thinking women are dumb, women thinking men are violent, white people being afraid of black people being afraid of white people. Based on personal experiences and anecdotal evidence, it's reasonable that anyone could come to these conclusions. But most of us try to educate people to let them know that it's not logical and it's not right. Just bear with me for one moment. According to Paul Irwin, he says there are twice as many men with an IQ above 120 than there are women. They even say that there are 30 times more men with an IQ above 170 than there are women. Now, we don't really know a whole lot about the IQs of bears, but according to bearsmart.com, they say bears are highly evolved social animals with intelligence comparable to that of the great apes. And Slate has an article about how smart the great apes are. The way that they tested their IQ was with number and memorization games. The humans scored 5, while the ape scored about 80. So while we know that on average, women's IQ is similar to men's, instead of looking at the average, if we look at the mean, there's a fairly big difference. Meaning that if some chimpanzees are scoring higher than some humans, they're likely scoring higher than a lot of women. And if bears are just as smart as chimpanzees, it's likely bears could actually solve the math problem better than lots of women. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that all women are dumb, but based on my personal experiences with women, and a common experience that lots of men have had, my initial instinct is to say that women will have trouble with math problems. And as the great John Adams once said, believe all men. I shouldn't have to explain to you why I think women are dumb. This is my personal experience. If men say women are dumb, that should be good enough for you. That's all you need to know. I'm willing to go through this much, but honestly, it's not my job to educate you. And I'm a bit blown away that there's a lot of women getting offended by this. As men, these are our experiences. You will never know what it's like to be on a date with a woman and have her demand that you split the check, yet she doesn't know how to divide. Over the last 50 years, men have scored higher in math on SAT scores than women. You know who hasn't failed any math tests over the last 50 years? Bears.